Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of eScience Global Economy Podcast. My name is Fredrik Erixon, and I am delighted to welcome back to this podcast my good friend Frank Lavin. Frank is, among other things, a fellow at the Hoover Institution of the Stanford University. He was until last year the CEO of e-commerce company Export Now and is the author of several books on economics and international affairs, including Homefront to Battlefront, a moving story about his father's adventures in Europe during the Second World War. Frank has had senior posts in national security and international policy in the administrations of the two Bush presidencies and was a close aide to Ronald Reagan during his time in the White House, something we will learn more about next year when Frank, in March, has his new book out, which is called Inside the Reagan White House, a front row seat to presidential leadership with lessons for today. Frank, welcome.
Thank you, Frederick. Great to be back with you. Good to chat with you, and always enjoy our conversations.
So do I. And today we are going to talk about a topic I assume you have spoken to a lot of people about in the past week, the incoming second Trump administration and what we can expect from it in foreign policy. Now, Trump, he's been around US politics for quite some time now, and the world got to know him already in his first time in the White House. But what type of Trump is it that is returning now, do you think? What is his general outlook on the world and America's role in it? And what do you think is what he wants to change?
Well, I think there's two or three elements of this new Trump administration that we're likely to see in the coming months. And by the way, I'd say, just as a preface to these comments, all candidates for office might have a gap or a difference between their stated policy goals they articulate in the course of a campaign and what they actually do in office. Trump has greater volatility than most in that regard. And I just point to his first term, where one of his core themes as a candidate was to end NAFTA, repeal NAFTA. The NAFTA was a disaster. And he did do some renegotiation of NAFTA, but it ended up being perhaps 99% the same as the original NAFTA. So the campaign rhetoric sort of out ran the actual reality. We might see elements of that again this time, but there are definitely some differences in stock. I would say the main difference is Trump is a person who it looks very much as foreign policy as a transaction rather than as a method of international architecture or philosophy. So I think he would not say America has intrinsic role to play in the world, whether there's value for the United States in coalition leadership or alliance relationships. But I think it's very much a question of what are you doing for me or to me, and what should I do for you or to you. So it's a much more transactional driven. The second point I would make is that he again, all political leaders have elements of this. Trump maybe more than most, emphasis on domestic U.S. politics, domestic political dimension, meaning foreign policy itself is not intrinsically useful or beneficial to the United States, but the domestic dimension of foreign policy is very much a matter of concern. It was noteworthy to me that the three themes that he raised in his first presidential run were three foreign policy themes that all had very strong domestic political impact: trade issues, dealing with unemployment, terrorism and security, and immigration. So there wasn't necessarily a Trump emphasis of foreign policy per se, but there's a very strong sensitivity to the domestic analog to international behavior. So that's the second. Sorry, one final thought is he's much more concerned about risk and downside than upside. Meaning, it's not. It's he doesn't ask a question about what kind of world do you want and what kind of leadership does America need to provide to get to that world. It's really a question of who is a threat to America and what should we do about it. That's how he views things. So, sorry, I cut you
Yeah,
off. Yeah.
no, no. And but if we take those three themes, I mean, they were the themes in his first campaign, and they were the themes in his second campaign. So there seems to be some continuity between them. But do you think that, can he claim that he now comes into office with a different mandate in order to achieve
Yeah.
things he weren't able to achieve in his first
Yeah.
administration? So building a wall or mass deportation of illegal immigrants or
Right.
changing the international system in a more fundamental way. Do you think that's part of his overall intention for the
Well,
next 4 years?
First, I think your premise is correct that he there's a lot of consistency between what Trump stood for and worked for his first term as president and what he's talking about doing now. So there might be some evolution or some changes, but by and large, it's a very similar approach. The sensitivity about immigration, hostility to trade, and concern about downside risk. Although interestingly, he sees, for example, Iran as more of a direct threat, but he doesn't see North Korea as a direct threat. He sees China as a economic threat, but he doesn't necessarily put the same kind of political military emphasis on China. And he tends not to see what Putin's doing, as a threat or a problem at all, except that war in general is a bad idea, but he approaches it sort of a value neutral or morally neutral approach. So he's got his own prism through which he looks at these different threats or different actors, but he's still very much downside oriented as he was 4 years ago.
Yeah. And also 4 years ago, and during the entire first Trump administration, even when he came in 2016, I think everyone understood that, this is a guy who doesn't like the international system within quotation marks, the rules, the institutions, the architecture,
Yeah.
the agreements that successive governments have done with each other over decades and decades. He, as you said, Frank, I mean, he wanted to use a maximum advantage strategy, trying to achieve as much for America or for him personally as he could, being pretty dismissal of that old architecture.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you can say, well, he may have been a disruptive presidency, but he also brought in a couple of new type of things. Not him personally, of course, but you had people like your current colleague H.R. McMaster, who in the national security, as a national security advisor, oversaw a pretty strong reorientation in America's security and foreign policy vis-a-vis China, a new doctrine. You saw an approach to alliance and alliances in Asia as well as Europe, which wasn't as dismissal as
Right.
Trump rhetoric would have you to think about it. So I'm curious about that because this entire veneer of unpredictability which is around him, I think it makes it difficult also now to try to understand what we can expect from the next 4 years. So do you think it's going to be something similar to what we had in his first administration, or is this going to be sort of completely off the rails? He's now out to crush things.
Yeah, no, I think similar to the first, that he's got impulses and a stage presence that is more audacious or more theatrical, but and his he can certainly challenge the established order. And you're right, he's very dismissive of established procedures and institutions, but not necessarily completely dismissive of them. I think what he's saying is process. These institutions are process oriented, and the mistake other American leaders have made, and maybe European leaders make, is you see the process as a value in itself or goal in itself. So you respect the process, but his point is, look, this was always a means to an end. And so you might say the EU as an institution has enormous value, but only has enormous value if it allows for economic growth and promotes peaceful European interaction, right? But just to say we're having more meetings in Brussels in itself, I think you would say that's not intrinsically valuable, intrinsically useful. Maybe many Europeans would agree with that as well. But then you're right; it can even be dismissive or disruptive because he was very skeptical of the value of the WTO, very skeptical, I think, of the value of the United Nations, and saying the best guarantor of U.S. security is simply U.S. hard power.
Let's review the troops a bit here because there is this argument, and I don't know really how much emphasis to put on it, but the argument is out there, which is that in his first administration, there were adult people in the room that could control his impulses. So we referenced H.R. McMaster previously,
Sure.
but you had Jim Mathis,
John
lots of
Bolton.
others that,
Sure.
yeah, exactly. John Bolton came in as national security advisor as well.
Pompeo was a serious
Pompeo, of course,
yeah,
yes,
sure.
yes,
Sure.
absolutely. I mean, these are all. I mean, Matt Pottinger. I mean, these are all serious policy
Right.
people.
Right.
But if we look at some of the nominations right now, so we have, we still have serious people like Marco Rubio,
Yeah, and I
who's
would say
been,
Waltz. I would say Waltz. I mean, the two leading
yeah,
foreign policy people are both have a grounding in foreign policy and are closer to a traditional view of American leadership in the world, right? So you've got at least two strong people there. But then when you get beyond that, and I put at least Stefanik, the who he tends to nominate for UN ambassador in the same category. So you've got at least
yeah.
three classical foreign policy types there. But when you move beyond that, it's a different world.
It is. So, new director of national intelligence, he's nominated Tulsi Gabbard. I think for many people in the world, the name of the nominated Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, was a surprise. Someone who hasn't really been around Trump circles, and those signals that he may not be interested in having sort of a continued type of approach as he had in the first administration. Do you think that's correct?
It's unclear. It's unclear. He because again, there'll be a difference between his rhetoric and reality, and we don't know to what extent he wants to fight for these people, to what extent he'll be successful getting them in. I would make a delineation there, if I may. I think the concern about Tulsi Gabbard, I think she's a capable person, but there are enormous concerns that her political philosophy, her ideology, is that she's sympathetic fundamentally to Putin. So there's enormous concern in the foreign policy community about her suitability for the job. Hegseth there's some questions about his philosophy, but there's a lot of questions just about his competency and his background, that he's never served in government management. He's been active duty military and he acquitted himself well, but that in itself doesn't necessarily mean you can run the whole ministry. So there's questions there as well. So, but we don't know to what extent the Senate will go along with Trump's proposals, to what extent they'll have an appetite for fight. I think there'll be very strong pushback against the Attorney General nomination, Gates, and there might be other pushbacks as well. But typically in these kind of discussions, there's a bit of a compromise that you can't stop every one of the president's nominees. So you say, well, who are the two or three most troubling that we really want to put our emphasis on, and then let the rest go through. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's what we end up with. So somebody said Hegseth might have been in trouble until Tulsi Gabbard was nominated and until Gates was nominated. Now Hegseth might just go through because I don't know if the Senate feels they can stop how many of his nominations they can stop.
Yeah, yeah. But if we take the known characters, Rubio, Waltz, Stefanik, do you agree that this um, um, sort of choices of people who are going to make China and threats from China a much stronger focus in all U.S. security and foreign policy?
Well, there's no. By the way, there's a bipartisan view that China is a clear and present danger. That China's behavior represents maybe the greatest current threat to the international order. Iran is also viewed in somewhat similar terms. It's got a much smaller capacity to do damage, but it's actively doing it. So Iran's support of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, I would add the support of Vladimir Putin, raise all sorts of questions, and nobody can call Iran a good faith actor. Uh, and there was a recent report a week or so ago that Iran dispatched some kind of a team to assassinate President-elect Trump. So they picked the wrong fellow because Trump tends to remember these sort of things. So I think Iran will loom large in the consciousness as well. And remember, Trump had his own individual meeting with Kim Jong Un. So I think for whatever set of reasons, North Korea is not viewed as hostile, and it's been a little more passive internationally lately.
Mm. But still, China. I get the feeling that it's China, 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 and you can always expand the
Yeah.
network of unfriendly nations to include Iran,
Mm.
Russia, North Korea, of course. But it's another step or another acceleration in a European foreign policy outlook where China is the main.
I
issue,
think you're
right?
right, and what China brings with it in a negative sense, China brings with it not just a political military challenge, but an enormous economic challenge as well. So China plays the role, so to speak, of villain more fittingly, you could say, than other countries play it, and that economic challenge is ongoing. What they're doing now with electric vehicles and their competition in South America and in Southeast Asia. So there's an ongoing set of challenges from China.
Mm. And how do you think current policies have been working when it comes to the China issue? So, I mean, it started already, as we talked about, under the first um, Trump administration. The Biden administration has basically doubled down on these policies with technology restrictions, human capital restrictions, more trade restrictions. The general outlook of the Biden administration too has been
Yeah.
that if not now, so at least in the future, the main threat is going to come from Beijing, and all U.S. policies have to be rearranged in order to accommodate that type of change.
I would
But
add two
how has
other.
it worked?
Sorry, I would add two other sort of more political or Paul Mill initiatives to what you just articulated. One is the Quad, which is an informal consultative mechanism, but the main value of which is that this integrates India a little bit more into political planning and defense planning. There's no formal treaty alliance with India as with the other members of the Quad, Japan and Australia, where there's enormous amount of mill to mill coordination and cooperation. But we see the relationship with India growing nicely. So the Quad is a nice step ahead. And AUKUS, which is the U.S., Great Britain, Australia submarine initiative, which likewise gives the UK a little role to play in the region, helps Australia move ahead in submarines. So that's a very nice initiative as well. So there's at least two I think useful building blocks in that policy. What's missing from all of this is what was originally called the TPP. The original view was to say the smaller nations and the mid-sized nations of East Asia are hungry for greater connectivity with the U.S. They don't want to have the sort of unipolar region where China is so dominant economically that it can really muscle into some political issues. So anything that can improve connectivity with the U.S. is to be welcomed by America as well as by the countries of East Asia. That was the logic behind the initiative. It became political in the course of Trump's first race. Trump said he was against it, was going to pull out. Hillary Clinton then did a backflip and said she was against it too, although she helped author it. And there's been no substitute or recrafting or redraft. And Biden made no efforts to get anything going in that space at all. So we ended up with 4 years of no trade initiatives, making Biden more hostile to trade than even Trump, because Trump had a very robust anti-trade rhetoric, but he went ahead and did a digital free trade agreement with Japan, and he launched a free trade negotiations with Kenya of all places. So Trump took some very modest steps for trade, and Biden said, "I will take no steps." So will Trump, for example, he could extend the Japanese digital free trade agreement to Southeast Asia, which would be welcome, I think, by all parties, and would be a nice signal to those markets that the U.S. is still looking for engagement and partnerships there. But he has not yet articulated what he wants to do, and he hasn't yet named a trade negotiator.
Do you think that Trump could, I mean, is there any chance at all that he can break out from that anti-trade rhetoric that we've heard during the campaign, which is a 10 to 20% tariff on all countries, plus of course 60%, something like that, on China, plus
Yeah, I think
something
he
something
will.
even
I think he
higher on
will move.
Mexico.
I think he will move away from that. Look again, if we go back to his first term, his signature themes that he talked about in the course of campaign was, we're going to pull out of NAFTA, which he didn't do. We're going to build a wall, which he did a little of, and we're going to repeal Obama's healthcare initiative, Obamacare, which he didn't do. So he had a very mixed record on these core campaign promises. So I could see there being a political payoff domestically in the U.S. for any tough stance on China, but I think there'll be enormous ambivalence about a global tariff of 20%. The U.S., by the way, U.S. economy, unemployment in the U.S. is now 4.1%. We're not quite at full employment, but we're getting close to it, meaning there's not going to be any onshoring or any relocation of jobs because of any kind of tariff. It's going to hurt jobs and hurt the U.S. economy. at this point. So I don't see there being a domestic political push for that. But I would not be surprised if there's a China initiative. And I would encourage Europe not to be passive about this, meaning uh, whatever messaging Europe can put forward that would allow Trump leadership to say, that's an interesting idea. So, for example, I would suggest something that Europe entertain a North Atlantic and EU US accord on electric vehicles that basically allows for free trade in electric vehicles between these two markets. So there'd be some lift for both countries, for both economies, I should say, uh, in this. But what it really does is change the debate from how difficult should I be in our trade relationship to where might there be opportunities to open up and get a win-win initiative going. And the other important point of the electric vehicle initiative is it's really a indirect move against China and China's attempt to penetrate both the U.S. and the European market with their EVs. So the more we can bolster ourselves, so to speak, the more stronger we are in a defensive move against China.
Hmm. Let's come to Europe in a moment, but just one more question on that China thing, because I mean it's not an original point, of course, but the there is a paradox in the strategy uh, from America if you say that you want to focus your activity on China, basically contain China's economic rise, avoid China to become more of a systemic influential operator in the global economy. And then you want to take tariff action against all countries in the world
Yeah,
because
it's
these are two
extraordinary.
competing
No,
objectives.
I completely agree, Frederick. There's enormous contradiction. I mean, to summarize Trumpism from his first term, he said, I want to punish unfair trading partners. And then my second goal is I want to punish all trading partners. And you say, well, that's a hell of a goal. You're making no discrimination or differentiation between people who play by the rules and people who don't play by the rules. You're just unhappy. You're just radiating ill will. And now, fortunately, in his first term, he didn't really do that. Uh, but who knows? He's sort of talking about it now, and he's sort of ballyhoos tariffs. Now, at least part of what he's doing is just mocking Biden and giving Biden a hard time. And I think he understood full well that Biden could copy or mimic Trump on some things, like I'll be tough on China trade. He could copy, but he's not going to copy Trump on global tariffs. So if the question for the American voter is who is the angriest or who is the toughest or who is the most unpleasant with trading partners, well, Trump wins that audience. And if that's taken as a metaphor for stewardship of U.S. economic interest or job protection, Trump wins. So part of what he's doing is posturing in the course of a campaign. But now what he intends to do next year is still very much a question mark.
Hmm.
But
All
but
right,
again, I would say
let's.
don't wait till he gives a speech on this. Don't wait. Come up with any kind of positive initiative that would strengthen the hands of people who are pro trade and engage with the U.S. administration.
Yeah, no, and I think that that is the lesson from the first administration as well,
Yeah.
is that, if you are proactive and you come with good faith initiatives which are sort of based on basically we want to trade on free and fair terms, not, we're not out to manipulate you or to take advantage of you or to subsidize our way to export success in America, then
Right.
you may be getting a good audience in America too.
No, you're right. You're right. That's a very good message, and Washington needs to hear that.
So let's turn to Europe a little bit more.
Sure.
Compared to the first administration, there's a very different type of Europe that he's confronted with now. I mean, as you said, in his first term, his rhetoric was almost as if he wanted revenge, and of course, Europeans were one of those actors who, he thought had taken advantage of America. Now he's confronted with uh, a European economy which is a lot weaker than it was in 2016. In terms of technology, in terms of innovation, the American economy has outperformed the European economy by sort of a pretty substantial margin. On the other hand, he's also meeting a Europe who is rearming, who is taking defense expenditures up quite significantly, not enough in my view, but significantly. They are probably going to go along with a new NATO target for defense spending at 3% of GDP. Most European governments are buying enormous amounts of equipment and kit from America in that rearmament program. So he has more of a friendly audience in that sense. But then, of course, we have the other issue, which is the big war, which he has said he's going to fix in 24 hours. But we don't know. Of course, we know that he's not going to be able to fix it in 24 hours, but we don't know what his grand idea is here. We don't know what he's going to play for. So, what's your take here? I mean, starting with this general outlook on Europe, if it's not going to be a strategy seeking retribution, what is then going to be his overall take on Europe and Europe's role in the type of foreign policy that we can expect from his administration?
Well, my starting point for this question, Frederick, is how we began our conversation today, which is he places less intrinsic value in architecture. So the idea of NATO itself is not intrinsically useful. And in fact, clearly he in the first term he saw this as a negative, that these were a collection of free riders, and even our best friends, so to speak, on a policy basis, very good friends, were underweight in terms of defense commitment. So I think that's a starting point. Now, as you point out, that might be a residual problem still, but it's significantly less of a problem and on its way to being largely corrected by the Europeans themselves. Nonetheless, I think he sort of starts with, if you will, a lack of enthusiasm about the European project, North Alliance, architecture, and saying this is a useful relationship. I think he views it as a legacy project. And as you point out, Europe's had long-term economic underperformance. So you'd say a big market, but nothing exciting, and there almost seems to be hostility to tech. So underweight on that. So I don't think he has any kind of special friendship or special awareness or special relationship with Europe, the way almost every other U.S. president has felt in the modern era, that Europe was the natural partner, the natural friend, the natural collaborator for any kind of international project because of convergence of values on democracy and human rights, and tradition of close cooperation, and NATO on top of all of that. So every other president started almost with a presumption of say, let's see what the Europeans think about this, and I think he's just much more of a go alone guy. By the way, in a negative sense, Trump's view of Europe is not radically different than China's view of Europe, which is to say Europe is just not that important, or Europe has made itself less important over the last decade or so. So what was striking for me is China decided, I think rather unnecessarily, rather gratuitously, to bet against Europe by backing Putin. And you'd say that's really an astonishing decision because Europe has such connectivity, economic connectivity with China, and it's an important market for both economies. Why in the world would China bet against and sort of actively support Putin in a hostile move to Europe? Well, I don't know if I have an answer to that question, but there's been no penalty from Europe for China's decision. So China is placing this bet, risk-free, cost-free bet against Europe. So you can't criticize it on the merits. You can criticize it morally or say it's bad policy, but you'd say, they're playing this bet and nobody in Europe's complained or raised it or done anything about it. So you'd say, look, if China can do that, why should U.S. take Europe seriously if China doesn't take Europe seriously?
Yeah, and isn't that the generic problem with Europe now, which is that there are too many actors in the world, even pretty small actors who think they can act opportunistically or even in a hostile way against Europe because they can do it with impunity. There's not going to be any strong reactions coming from Europe because it's incapable of reacting to it.
I think that's a very fair, if unsettling, concern, and it sort of bolsters the validity of Trump's original complaint to say these fellows are sort of free riders. They are underweight. Your defense expenditures are 1% of your GDP. This is you're not able to play a constructive role.
Mm, yeah. Now, Ukraine. So, what will Trump want to do with Ukraine and Russia's war in Ukraine?
Well, I here's my starting point: that Trump does not see anything here at stake besides a rivalry, if you will, geopolitical competition. It's almost a 19th century view of Europe. I'm thinking of Anglo-French rivalry in the 19th century, that Americans would look at that and say, look, we are neutral. But both these countries are more or less friends with the United States. We don't see any advantage or disadvantage if one of these countries dominates in one part of Africa and another dominates another part. It doesn't matter. So we have no desire to support one group or the other. I think this is very much how Trump views Russia and Ukraine. A big country's invaded a small one, so what? A big country trying to grab some of the small country's land, so what? There's nothing broader at stake. There's no broader U.S. interest at stake. So why does the U.S. have to adjudicate a territorial dispute between different people? Right. Yeah, I think that's broadly inaccurate, but I think that does summarize how
Yeah.
he views it. So I think it's up to what I would advise anybody in Europe who sees it differently, that this is actually quite harmful to Western interest, including United States interest, and you're empowering Russia, you're empowering China, and you're empowering Iran and North Korea by allowing Putin to prevail. Uh, I would say do what we can do to push back, even in these 10 weeks left between the U.S. election and Trump's inauguration. Whatever hand Ukraine has to play, that much stronger hand will help them in any kind of final negotiations with Russia.
Yeah. But that analysis basically suggests that when Trump says, I'm going to solve this in 24 hours, that basically means I'm going to just make a statement to say, we're not going to take any interest in this anymore. We're not going to send any more money. We're not going to send any more equipment. We're not going to aid Ukraine. And that basically means Russia is basically free to do whatever it wants to do until sort of someone else comes in and aid Ukraine in its overall war effort, right?
Well, it might even be more harmful than that, Frederick. It might be we will accept a treaty or push a treaty that recognizes current limits of control, current areas of control. So we're going to declare Russia a victor, and we're going to lock in place current territorial gains of Russia, and we're going to push that as saying that's where things are. That's where things are. There's no sense having more of a war. So it's sort of
But
like how.
why but why stop there? I mean,
Uh,
if America's just going to pull out and say we don't have any interest in this anymore, any type of technology contribution we're making right now, the sort of Pentagon engineers that are helping Ukraine with its overall defense. Sorry, they're not going to do this anymore. So if that's the message, why is Putin going to stop with the territories they're already taking? Why not go towards Kiev? Because there's not going to be much more resistance if the Americans stop supporting with equipment, weapons, human
he
capital, knowledge, etc.
he might. I think it's hard to predict Putin as well, and Putin's got his own psychology involved with this at this point, his own ego, his own legacy. So it's a little unclear what Putin at this point needs to be able to declare victory and say it was a wise leadership on his part that got, because even with, as you're suggesting, even with current territorial success, I think you'll have widespread unhappiness in Russia, the general population saying, "What in the world were we doing? Why did we spend several years of our life have a 600,000 plus casualties for 100 square mile? I mean, it looks terrible." So he might say, "Here's my opportunity." Well, I would say we tilt against that, lean against that, if Europe's able to fill some of the gap and whatever can be done in these next 6 weeks to bolster Ukraine. And I'd say something else. Trump, I don't think Trump minds some kind of nominal Russian victory, but I think Trump does mind being embarrassed. And there's a good prospect of Putin overplaying his hand or presuming on a friendship or Trump having domestic U.S. political criticism because Putin gets some kind of victory out of this. So I think those elements of it would be more meaningful than actual stability or fairness or the peace treaty itself. So I don't think we know what the ultimate outcome will be. I don't think we know what might satisfy Putin. I think it's going to be a very difficult sell in Ukraine to say, my friends, this is all you've got, so you've got to give up. We're not going to support. And I don't think what will Europe do if the United States declares January 20th, we are comfortable with the lines currently in place, and we will not support Ukraine efforts beyond where we currently are. What will Europe still say we're going to fill that gap, or will Europe say we're hopeless? We can't fill that gap.
I think we already know the answer to that, which is that Europe can't. And of course, there are several European governments that have been equally looking for an off-ramp from this war. The latest one being Olaf Scholz in a television interview earlier this week. And in terms of capacity, in terms of stocks, Europe doesn't really have what Ukraine needs, and
Right.
have also demonstrated, just like the Biden administration has done, that they aren't willing to give Ukraine the weapons it needs in order to win.
It's an astonishing moment of a misplayed hand and a lack of leadership. I mean, America's. It's not a lack of leadership, but it's a selection of a leadership that is indifferent. In Europe, I think it's a lack of leadership. There's no now. Germany has elections coming up that might change, but that's February, right? So that might change the situation a bit. But I have trouble seeing good news in this picture, even if we don't know what the ultimate outcome is.
Yeah, indeed. But sort of taking your argument then, so the best, uh, uh, or perhaps what we can hope for, is that if there's one thing we know about Trump, it is that he doesn't want to be seen as a loser. He doesn't
Mm,
want to be seen as he was played by Putin.
right,
He wanted to find a resolution to the war, but the reality was that Putin uh, received it as an opportunity to become even more hostile
right.
and take the war further into Ukrainian territory. What do you think people like Marco Rubio and others? I mean, they have voted against U.S. Financial aid packages, including, of course, arms equipment to Ukraine. I wouldn't say that they've been flippant about NATO, but of course, they've also had a rhetoric around United States participation in NATO, which at least signals awkwardness and a discomfortability with where things are standing right now. How do you think people like Rubio are going to find a role or find an orientation in this Trump administration that allows
Yeah,
him, for instance, to be more of a leader in
right.
building something new rather than
I
just
think this is a
tearing things apart?
question. I think this is a question we're all asking, that we don't yet have a harmonized Trump foreign policy. That we have new players, but we're not completely sure about the relative weight and the relative influence of each of these new players. Uh, I think uh, I think Rubio and Walt and Stefanik, who might represent the more traditional view of foreign policy, are also very good Washington operatives and have good antenna, good radar, and good at sort of Trump management, Trump interaction. So the point is, it's almost like that old saying in a professional consultancy: know your client, understand your client. You can only move your client so much, so you have to respect your client's ultimate wishes. So it doesn't do you any good to yell at the president and say he's got it wrong, because he'll just dig in. But you might be able to move him 1%, 2%, 5%, and you might be able to get him just. And one of the striking examples of this over the last 12 months was how Trump viewed the abortion issue. That he was very much in line with traditional Republican views of being anti-abortion, until the Supreme Court changed the rules and became a state issue. And then he sort of took a hands-off or laissez-faire, meaning he wasn't going to adhere to this as a matter of principle or philosophy or his view of this issue at all. But he took a very practical view of U.S. politics toward that. So he's got that element to his persona. So I'd say there is room for movement. We don't know what the ultimate outcome will be, but it behooves anybody who views Putin with dismay. It behooves that any European country who says we don't want Putin to prevail, it behooves those countries to be as supportive as possible of Ukraine to make it as easy as possible for Trump to be tolerant of Ukraine or sensitive to Ukraine's needs as well. If Trump says I'm the only guy here helping Ukraine, Europe is all talk and no action. Uh, what's the point? What's the point of this? And Putin's not such a bad guy anyhow, right? That's a bad case scenario.
Yeah. Frank, we are going to end this podcast very soon, but I have one more final question for
Right.
you. And we go back to where we started and your forthcoming book.
Excellent.
So we had a great president in America in the late 1980s who was confronted with a world that wasn't that much different from the world we're confronted with now. What's the leadership lesson from how Reagan approached his world? What can we learn from him today?
Well, I think it's very different than viewing foreign policy as a transaction. I think you'd say there's a set of values. What kind of world do you want? What constitutes a successful, a stable, a peaceful, a prosperous world? What allows us to get there? And then both how do we adopt policies that let us go there, and how do we build coalitions? How do we work with like-minded nations? Because what we're articulating, peace and prosperity, are sort of universal values that other countries should adhere to as well. So unless you're in the Soviet orbit, unless you're part of the Soviet empire, you're going to be at least somewhat sympathetic to this U.S. articulation. And let's do it through messaging and communication, and let's also do it through formal alliance relationships. And by the way, a lot of this came out of U.S. leadership in World War II, very much the same set of principles that we enhance our own security by working with like-minded nations. So it's not so alliance relationships aren't a question of, it's not a matter of charity. It's not because we feel we need to help people out. It's for our own security. We want to have countries that feel the same way we do, that are democratic and respect human rights and are market-oriented economics, that find mechanisms for us all to work together. I would say you're absolutely right, Frederick. This is the world we're in today. To the extent the U.S. and other democracies and advanced industrial nations can find ways to work together, we're going to be happier with the outcomes. So that's the core lesson of the Reagan White House, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, and if we take that cue as well, I mean, it's a Reaganite approach today would of course also include some of the stuff that we can, at least in a milder form here, coming out from people, sort of clever people around Trump, which is that there are a couple of architectural changes that needs to happen in the world. I mean, we are confronted
Right,
with
right,
a China who has sometimes hostile intents, at least in terms of trying to rewrite the rules for how the global market is going
right.
to operate, who are hostile to its neighbors, who are threatening maritime sea lanes, securities in for our trading routes, who have increasingly built up alliances and, well, not alliances, but at least friendships with countries that have proved to be direct hostile to Western values. And there will have to be some rewriting of that architecture. Wouldn't that also be a Reaganite type of approach to this world?
I think so. I think so. I'm not sure Trump sort of has the patience or the nuance to go down that path, but I think you're right. There's a view to say, look, the United Nations can be used by undemocratic forces or even extremist groups to promote their agenda more readily than the democracies can work together. So some of these international institutions need to be reformed, or maybe we're in an era where ad hoc initiatives such as the Quad consultative mechanism or G7 consultative mechanism, they don't really have a staff or secretariat or an office building. So it's mainly just a way of saying, can we coordinate better on some issues? Are more useful than these long dated, large scale institutions like the United Nations or even some of the European Union institutions. So I would look, and I would say also there's a huge need for leadership. There's a need for some positive movement on trade issues, on economic issues, on political military issues to allow like-minded nations to find organizing principles and to work together. So I'd say wherever there are areas for U.S. to cooperate with Europe or Europe to cooperate, we should do it, even if it's ad hoc, a bit case by case. At least we're establishing or reestablishing patterns of cooperation that I think are extremely useful for both parties.
Indeed. Frank, it's been great talking to you. And let me just repeat where I also started, which is that you have a new book coming out next year, which is called Inside the Reagan White House, a front row seat to presidential leadership with the lessons for today. And I urge everyone to do what I've done, which is I have placed a pre-order on Amazon. So I'm sure to get it as soon as it hits the
Excellent.
bookshelves.
Thanks so much,
Thanks so
Frederick.
much, Frank.
Thank you so much for having me on. I always enjoy the chat. I always learn. I want to see you in the United States pretty soon.
Hope to see you soon.
Thanks.